She was still smiling when she walked out of his hotel suite. That was the part that broke Elena Voss. Not the stranger's face, not the borrowed shirt hanging loose off her shoulders, not even the way the woman laughed at something on her phone, like the morning belonged to her. It was the smile. Easy, unhurried, the smile of someone who had nowhere better to be. Elena stood frozen in the corridor of the Harrington Grand, the ultrasound photo pressed flat against her palm, the edges already soft from how many times she'd folded and unfolded it since the clinic. 12 weeks. Strong heartbeat. She'd driven 40 minutes through morning traffic just to surprise him, just to see his face when she'd told him. She never made it to the door. If you've ever stood in a hallway and watched your entire future rearrange itself in front of you, stay with me. Because what happens next will change everything you think you know about love, loyalty, and the price of silence. Hit that like button, drop your city or country in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. This one's going to take everything you have. Elena Voss was not a woman who fell apart easily. She had grown up in a house where crying was something you did in the shower with the water running loud enough to cover the sound, where you learned early that feelings were private things, expensive things, things you kept folded up inside your chest like documents you hoped you'd never need. Her mother had been practical, and her father had been absent, and somewhere between those two facts she had built herself into a person who could handle most things standing up. She had handled the first year of marriage to Cashin Moretti standing up. The canceled dinners. The phone calls that came at 2 in the morning and pulled him out of bed like a hook through the jaw. The security team stationed outside every restaurant they ever tried to eat at together. She had handled all of it with the quiet patience of someone who believed the man underneath the machine was worth the wait. What she could not handle was the smile. The woman who stepped out of Suite 1408 was perhaps 28, dark hair still damp at the ends. She wore a white dress shirt that Elena recognized. She had ironed that shirt herself 4 months ago, had hung it in the wardrobe of their home in Westport, had noticed when it disappeared from the closet 2 weeks later, and assumed it had gone to the dry cleaner. The woman had the collar turned up and the cuffs rolled to the elbow, and she was texting someone with both thumbs and smiling at whatever the response was, and she moved down the corridor without looking up, without looking at Elena at all, like Elena was furniture, like Elena was the one who didn't belong there. Elena's hand went cold around the ultrasound photo. She looked down at it. The tiny comma shape of the baby was visible even in the poor corridor lighting, the spine curled, the skull barely formed. 12 weeks. She had spent 3 days deciding how to tell him. She had practiced the sentence in the car on the way over. Cashin, I need you to sit down. She had imagined his face doing something she had not seen it do in months, going soft at the edges, the careful mask he wore everywhere dropping just for a moment, just for her. She looked back at the door of Suite 1408. It was closed now. The corridor was empty. The woman was already at the elevator, already gone, and the only evidence she had ever existed was the faint drag of her perfume and the fact that Elena's entire understanding of her marriage had just quietly collapsed like a building that had been undermined for years before the walls finally gave. She did not knock on the door. She didn't scream. She didn't call his name. She stood in that corridor for perhaps 30 seconds, which is a very long time to stand completely still in a hotel hallway, and then she looked down at the ultrasound photo one more time. She thought about sliding it under the door. She thought about leaving it at the front desk with a note. She thought about a lot of things in those 30 seconds, most of them violent in their own quiet way. What she did instead was fold the photo in half, then in half again. She pressed it into her coat pocket, and then she turned around and walked to the elevator and pressed the button and stood with her back very straight and her eyes very dry until the doors opened and she got inside and the doors closed behind her. She made it to the parking garage before her knees stopped working. She sat on the concrete floor between her car and the next one, her back against the driver's side door, and she pressed both hands flat to the ground because the ground was the only thing that felt real. Her breath was doing something wrong, coming in too shallow, too fast. She had to work to slow it down. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way you breathe when you're trying very hard not to become a person who sits on parking garage floors and falls to pieces. She was a person sitting on a parking garage floor falling to pieces. She stayed there for 11 minutes. She knew because she watched the clock on her phone. Then she got up, got in the car, and drove home. She did not call him. Cassian Moretti's morning had been entirely ordinary, which was itself a kind of lie, because nothing about Cassian Moretti's life had been ordinary for the past 22 years. He had built his empire the way most men of his particular background did, through a combination of intelligence, violence, and the willingness to make decisions that other men flinched from. By the time he was 30, he controlled the docks. By 35, 3 of the city's 6 council members returned his calls before they returned anyone else's. Now at 41, he was the kind of man who did not need to raise his voice because everyone in any room he entered already knew exactly what he was capable of. He took his morning coffee by the window of suite 1408, watching the city come alive 12 floors below, and he thought about the meeting at 11 and the problem with the Trevano shipment and the fact that his underboss, Silas Romano, had flagged something in the Western accounts that needed attention before the end of the week. He did not think about Elena. This was not unusual. This was in fact the problem, though Cassian would not understand that until much later, when the shape of what he had lost became visible to him. The way the scale of a landscape only becomes clear when you're standing at the bottom of it. He loved his wife the way certain men love things they believe are permanent, without urgency, without demonstration, with the comfortable certainty of someone who has never once considered losing her. He showered, he dressed, he answered the 11 o'clock call from his lawyer and the 11:45 call from a shipping contact in Rotterdam, and the 12:30 lunch with 2 men whose names he would not say on a telephone. By 3 in the afternoon, he was in a black SUV heading back to the house in Westport, running 35 minutes late for a dinner he had not told Elena he would be missing. He would tell her when he got home. He always told her when he got home. By then, of course, it was always already too late to change it. The house was quiet when he walked in. This was not unusual either. Elena was often reading in the sitting room at this hour, or in her studio at the back of the house where she kept the drafting table and the stacks of art books she was always intending to read. He set his jacket on the chair in the hall. Elena had asked him 100 times not to leave it there, and he always meant to stop doing it. And he called her name once, loosely, the way you call someone's name when you expect them to call back. Silence. He checked the sitting room. Empty. The studio. Empty. The kitchen, where her coffee mug was in the drying rack beside the sink, and the dishwasher was running and everything was exactly as it should be, except that she wasn't there. He checked his phone. No messages. He told himself she had probably gone to visit her friend Mara, who lived in the next town over and who Elena had been closer to recently, or so he assumed. He had not been paying close attention. He told himself he would ask her when she got home. He poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey and sat in the chair in the sitting room and opened the report Silas had sent over, and he read it for 40 minutes, and then he ate the dinner that the housekeeper had left covered on the stove, and then he went to bed. Elena did not come home. He noticed at midnight. He registered it the way you register a change in air pressure, something different in the room, something off. He reached for his phone, and called her. It went to voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. He sat up in bed in the dark and stared at the ceiling and told himself there was a reasonable explanation. There was always a reasonable explanation, and he almost believed it. Almost. She answered on the 3rd call the next morning. Elena. His voice came out rougher than he intended. Relief and something harder underneath it. Where are you? I came home and you weren't. I know. Her voice was completely flat. Not cold, not angry. Flat in the way a landscape is flat after something has been razed to the ground. I'm not coming back, Cassian. He went very still. What does that mean? It means what I said. Elena. He was standing now, had moved to the window without being aware of doing it, the way his body always needed to be in motion when his mind was trying to catch up. Whatever happened, whatever you think happened, you need to talk to me. You can't just... I saw her. Just 3 words. But she said them the way you say words that have been sitting in your chest all night, becoming heavier. I was there, Cassian, at the hotel. I came to surprise you, and I saw her walking out of your suite wearing your shirt, and I need you to understand something. A pause. He heard her breathe. I'm not calling to fight. I'm not calling to hear an explanation. I'm calling because you deserve to know that I was there, that's all. Elena, don't. Not loud, just final. Please don't do what you're about to do. I don't know what you think you saw. I know what I saw. Still flat, still that terrible, exhausted calm. I'm not confused. I'm not overreacting. I know what a woman looks like walking out of a man's hotel room in his shirt. I know what that is. His mind was running hard and fast now, pulling at the edges of the previous day, trying to reconstruct it. The suite, the morning. He had been alone until his 11 o'clock call. He had been entirely alone. There had been no woman. There had been no one. There was nobody there, he said. Cassian. There was nobody there, Elena. I was alone all morning. I don't know who you saw, but she wasn't with me. She was never with me. A silence. Long enough that he thought she had hung up. Long enough that he had time to notice his own heartbeat had changed register, was doing something unfamiliar in his chest, something that felt like the first clean note of fear. That's what they all say, Elena said, and hung up. He called back 14 times. She did not answer. He called Silas at 7 in the morning and told him to clear the day. Silas, who had been Cassian's underboss for 11 years and who never showed surprise at anything, asked no questions. By 9 a.m., Cassian had driven back to the Harrington Grand and was standing at the front desk with the particular expression on his face that made hotel staff suddenly remember things they had not previously recalled. The manager brought the security footage himself. Cassian watched it in a back office with Silas standing 2 steps behind him and a hotel security supervisor who kept his eyes on the middle distance and breathed very carefully through his nose. The timestamp read 9:47 a.m. The angle covered the corridor outside suite 1408. And there, emerging from the door with the easy confidence of someone who had every right to be there, was a woman Cassian had never seen before in his life. Dark hair, white shirt. His shirt. He recognized it now. The particular cut of the collar, the monogram that Elena had insisted on when she ordered it for his birthday. He felt something cold move through him. "Who is she?" he said. The security supervisor cleared his throat. "She checked in 2 days ago. A reservation under the name Claire Vander. Paid cash, no identification on file beyond what was submitted, which our team has since identified as..." He stopped, looked at the paper in his hand. "Fraudulent." Cassian looked at Silas. Silas's expression did not change. He was a lean man, 53, with the kind of stillness that could read as patience or as something else depending on the day. "I'll find out who she is," he said. "Today." Not a question. "Today." Cassian looked back at the screen, the timestamp, the corridor. The woman walking out of a room he had been sleeping in, wearing a shirt that had once hung in his wardrobe at home, with an expression on her face like she owned the morning. He thought about Elena standing somewhere in that same corridor, watching this. He drove back to the house and sat in the driveway for 7 minutes without getting out of the car, which was something he had never done in his life. There was a feeling building in him that he did not have a name for. Not guilt, not yet. Something older and more structural. The feeling of a man who has been moving at speed in a particular direction for a very long time and has just caught, at the very edge of his peripheral vision, the first suggestion that the road he is on does not go where he thought. He got out of the car. He went inside. He stood in the doorway of Elena's studio and looked at the drafting table, the art books, the small framed photograph on the shelf. The 2 of them at the coast 3 years ago, the last real vacation they had taken together. She was laughing in it. He was looking at her. He had never noticed that detail before. He picked up his phone and called her again. This time she didn't answer and did not call back, and the voicemail box was full. And when he tried the apartment of her friend Mara answered and said Elena wasn't there, and said it in the particular tone of voice that told him Mara knew exactly where Elena was and had been instructed to say otherwise. He sat down on the stool at Elena's drafting table, set his phone face down. And for the first time in perhaps 20 years, Cassian Moretti sat completely still and did not know what to do next. In the pocket of her coat, folded twice, the ultrasound photo waited in a drawer on the other side of the city. 12 weeks. Strong heartbeat. A life he did not yet know existed, that had been on its way to him that morning before everything went wrong. He would find out. He would eventually find all of it out. But first would come the silence. And the silence, he was beginning to understand, was its own kind of verdict. The silence lasted 6 days. Cassian knew because he counted them. Not deliberately. He was not a man who counted days, who marked time in the sentimental way of people who have too much of it. But he knew because each morning he woke in the same bed they had shared for 4 years and reached across the same empty space, and the number updated itself in the back of his skull like a tally kept by someone he didn't particularly like. 6 days. No calls returned. No messages. Nothing. He had people who could find anyone. He had people who could find anyone anywhere in the world within 48 hours. People who had located men hiding in countries they had entered under false names and false faces. He had not used them yet. This decision was not generosity. It was the last fragment of something he was not yet willing to name. The idea that if he forced this, if he used the machinery of his life to drag her back into his sight, whatever was left between them would not survive the contact. So he waited. And the waiting was a different kind of violence. On the 7th morning, Silas Romano arrived at the house in Westport without calling first. This itself was unusual. Silas had been with Cassian since the beginning, since the years when there had been nothing to be underboss of, when they were both younger and harder and operated out of a warehouse near the docks that smelled of diesel and salt water. He was one of perhaps 3 people in the world who could walk through Cassian's front door unannounced and leave with all his teeth. He sat across from Cassian at the kitchen table. Between them was a manila folder, which he set down but did not open. "Tell me," Cassian said. Silas placed one hand flat on the folder, not opening it, just resting there. "The woman from the hotel, Claire Vander. The name is a construction, built 18 months ago, social security number purchased, credit history manufactured." "Who built it?" "Someone who knew how." Silas looked at him steadily. "This wasn't amateur work, Cass. The identity has depth, backstory. It was built to survive a casual check." Cassian said nothing. He was looking at the folder. "She was placed," Silas continued. "The reservation for the room adjacent to yours was made 6 weeks before your stay. Whoever did this knew your schedule, your hotel preferences, the specific suite you use when you're in the city for overnight meetings." He paused. "They knew about the shirt." That last part landed differently. Cassian looked up. "What do you mean they knew about the shirt?" "The shirt she was wearing, monogrammed, the same brand and cut you use. It wasn't yours specifically. We confirmed your wardrobe is intact. It was a duplicate, ordered 4 months ago from the same tailor with the same monogram from a different billing address." Silas let that sit for a moment. "Someone who knew your tailor, someone who knew your monogram, someone who knew that Elena would recognize it." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the light was doing something gray and complicated with the clouds. "This was built for her," Cassian said. Not a question. The entire thing was staged for an audience of 1. Silas finally opened the folder, slid a photograph across the table. Security camera from the parking structure beneath the hotel. Timestamp 9:41 a.m., 6 minutes before the woman left your floor. Cassian looked at the photograph. It was grainy and shot from a high angle, the way security cameras always are, flattening everything into something that looks slightly unreal. But the figure was unmistakable. The dark coat. The particular way she held herself, shoulders level, chin up, the posture of a woman who has spent years learning how to walk through rooms that were not built for her. Elena. She had been there. He had known she had been there. She had told him herself. But seeing it was different. Seeing the timestamp, the angle, the fact that the camera caught her at the elevator and she was already pressing the button, already leaving, already gone. He sat with that for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "Who?" Silas closed the folder. "I don't know yet." "But you have a direction." A pause that lasted 1 second too long. "I have some early indicators. Nothing I'm ready to bring to you yet." Cassian looked at him. Silas met the look without moving. This was the thing about Silas. He had always been able to meet Cassian's eyes when other men looked away, and Cassian had always taken that as a mark of loyalty. He took it as that now. He would remember this moment later, would turn it over in his hands like an object he'd been carrying without knowing its weight. "Then move faster," Cassian said. Silas picked up the folder and left. That's Elena was staying at a place she had rented under her maiden name, Voss, not Moretti, in a neighborhood on the north side of the city that Cassian's world did not typically touch. It was a 2-room apartment on the 4th floor of a building that had a broken elevator and a superintendent who asked no questions. She had found it through Mara, who had a cousin who needed to sublet for 3 months, and she had paid the first 2 months in cash from the emergency fund she had kept in a private account since the first year of her marriage. She was not proud of the account. She was also not ashamed of it. She had opened it during the 2nd month of their marriage, when she had first started understanding the specific texture of the life she had walked into. Not because she planned to leave, she had not planned anything. It was more like the instinct to keep a spare key hidden somewhere only she knew about. Not because you expect to be locked out, but because you have begun to understand that locks exist. The apartment had one window that faced an air shaft and another that looked over a parking lot. She had bought a cheap curtain rod from a hardware store 2 blocks over and hung it herself, which had taken her 40 minutes and left 3 small holes in the wall that she covered with the curtain anyway. She had bought a coffee maker and a set of 4 mugs and 2 plates and a pot for the stove. She had not bought anything else. She didn't want to accumulate things here. She didn't want this to become a life. She just needed it to be a place where she could breathe until she figured out what came next. She was 8 weeks into figuring that out when her phone rang and the screen said Mara, and she answered it, and Mara's voice came through tight and careful, the voice she used when she was trying not to transmit her own fear. "He's asking questions," Mara said. "Not to me directly, through people. You know how he does it." Elena sat down on the edge of the bed. "How long?" "I think he's known roughly where you are for at least a week. I think he's been—" Mara stopped. "I think he's been not coming, Elena. I don't know what that means. I thought you should know." Elena looked at the curtain over the airshaft window. "It means he's respecting something," she said, "which is new. Are you okay? Physically, I mean. I'm fine. The appointment last week was fine. Everything is—" She pressed her hand flat to her stomach. 14 weeks now. She was not showing in any way that a coat wouldn't hide. "Everything is fine. You need to tell him." "Mara, I know what you're going to say, but you need to think about—" "I have thought about it." Her voice came out harder than she intended. She softened it deliberately. "I've thought about nothing else. But I can't have that conversation right now. I can't stand in front of him with this and have him think that it's leverage, or that I'm coming back because of it. I can't." Mara was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said finally. "Okay. But Elena, he's not going to stop looking." "I know," Elena said. "He never stops." She hung up and sat on the bed in the apartment with the broken elevator for a long time, her hand still resting at her stomach, the curtain moving slightly in a draft from somewhere she had never been able to locate. But the cracks in the organization started the way structural damage always starts. Invisibly, then all at once. Cassian had been running on diminished attention for 3 weeks now, and in his world, diminished attention was an invitation. 2 shipments came in short. A payment arrangement with a contact in Philadelphia went sideways in a way that should have been caught 2 days earlier. A meeting with the Port Authority liaison, the kind of meeting that required Cassian's specific presence and specific manner, had to be rescheduled when he missed it by 40 minutes because he had been sitting in a parked car outside a building on the north side of the city, not going in. He had found her location on day 9. He had driven there on day 11. He had sat in the car for 22 minutes and then driven home. He could not explain this behavior to himself in terms that satisfied him. He was not a man who sat outside buildings. He was not a man who waited for permission. He had walked into rooms where men pointed guns at him, and he had been less afraid than he was of knocking on that door. It was Silas who finally forced the issue. Not about Elena, but about business. "You need to be present," Silas told him. They were in the office at the back of the restaurant on Carmine Street, the one that had been a meeting place for 15 years. Silas was standing. Cassian was behind the desk, but the body language was wrong, and they both knew it. Catello called twice. The Trevano arrangement is hanging by handle Catello. I have been handling Catello. I've been handling a lot of things, but there's a limit to what I can hold in place without you. Silas paused. People are reading the absence. It's creating uncertainty. Let them be uncertain. Cassian. Something shifted in Silas's voice. Something that Cassian registered but didn't examine. Not then. If you want to go get your wife, go get her. But you can't continue to be half present and expect the architecture to hold. That's not how this works. Cassian looked at him for a long time. Silas looked back. The same steady eyes, the same patience that had always read as loyalty. You're right, Cassian said. Set the Trevano meeting for Thursday. I'll be there. Silas nodded. Left. Cassian sat alone in the office on Carmine Street and pulled out his phone and called Elena's number for the first time in 8 days. It rang 4 times. He prepared for voicemail. She answered. The silence lasted about 3 seconds, and it was the loudest 3 seconds he could remember. Cassian. Not a question, not a greeting, just the acknowledgement that she knew who it was. I need to see you, he said. No. Elena, I said no. A pause. He heard her breathing. Calling me doesn't change anything. I have proof, he said, that the woman was planted, that the whole thing was staged. I have security footage. I have a false identity constructed specifically to... Stop. Her voice had changed, something moving through it that he couldn't name. Stop, Cassian. I hear what you're saying. Then let me show you... It doesn't matter. The words came out quiet, but with a weight behind them that he felt physically. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Even if everything you're saying is true, even if I believe you completely, it doesn't fix what was already broken. He said nothing. Because she was right, and he knew she was right. And knowing she was right was a different kind of pain than anything he had experienced in a long time. You want to come show me evidence, Elena continued. You want to bring me proof and have me understand you didn't do this thing, and then you want us to go back to... She stopped. To what, exactly? To you working 18-hour days and me learning how to not mind? To dinners where your phone is more present than you are? To 4 years of marriage where I stopped telling you things because you were never actually there to hear them? Elena, I stopped telling you things, Cassian. Important things. Things a wife should be able to tell her husband. A breath. And you never even noticed. The silence after that was of a different quality. Not cold. Something more like the quiet of a room after a piece of furniture has been moved. The suddenly visible outline of where it used to be. What things? He said. His voice came out wrong, rough in a way he hadn't planned. Not now. She sounded tired, not angry anymore, just tired in the way that comes from carrying something alone for too long. I can't do this on the phone. Then let me come. A long pause. He didn't breathe through it. Give me a week, she said finally. I need a week. He wanted to argue. The part of him that had been trained to move fast, to close gaps, to never give an opponent time to regroup. That part said to push. To go now. To not wait. He said, okay. She hung up. He sat with the phone in his hand and the empty office around him, and the feeling that he had just made the most important negotiation of his life without understanding any of the terms. Silas received the call at 11:14 that night. He was in his car, not at home, which was itself a small tell. Silas Romano lived 15 minutes from the restaurant on Carmine Street and had no reason to still be driving at 11 on a Tuesday unless he was going somewhere he did not want logged. He answered on the second ring. She's still in the city, the voice on the other end said. Male. Careful. The particular flatness of someone reading from a mental script. He called her tonight. She agreed to see him. Silas said nothing for 3 seconds. Outside his windshield, the city ran its usual circuits. Headlights, pedestrians, the orange glow of a streetlight on wet pavement. When? He said. She asked for a week. He agreed. Another pause. Silas turned left at the intersection without signaling. That's a problem. I know. It needs to move faster. Silas's voice had not changed register. He could have been discussing the weather or a supply manifest or any other ordinary fact of business. She can't be reachable when he goes looking, and if he finds out what he's about to find out about the accounts, he'll connect it before we're ready. I can put eyes on her, make sure but not eyes. Silas stopped at a red light. Resolution, before the week is up. A beat. Make it look like she left. Moved on. Went somewhere he can't follow. The voice on the other end was quiet for a moment. Then, that's a significant escalation. Yes, Silas said. It is. He ended the call. The light turned green. He drove. In the apartment on the north side of the city, Elena Voss lay on her side on a narrow bed with her knees drawn up and her hand resting at the small curve of her stomach, listening to the building settle around her. She was 15 weeks along. She had an appointment on Thursday. She had called no one in her family and told no one but Mara and the doctor, and she was so tired of carrying this alone that the tiredness had become its own kind of companion, familiar, ever-present, the thing that walked with her from room to room in the apartment with the broken elevator and the curtain that moved in a draft she could never find the source of. She thought about what she had said to Cassian. I stopped telling you things. She had meant to say it differently. She had meant to say it clearly and precisely, the way she'd rehearsed it in the bathroom mirror twice in the past week, laid out like evidence, logical, controlled. Instead, it had come out raw and slightly crooked, the way true things usually did when you finally stopped holding them back. She had not meant to agree to see him. She lay in the dark and told herself it was because she owed him the confrontation, because carrying this silently was its own kind of cowardice, because their son, she thought, and the words still moved through her with a force she was not ready for, deserved more than two parents who communicated through absence and hung up phone calls. She did not let herself think about what it had felt like to hear his voice say okay in that particular way, with that particular silence before it. She could not afford to think about that. Outside on the street below, a car she had not noticed before was parked at the corner. It had been there since 9. The engine was off. The windows were dark. If Elena had looked, she might have wondered about it, but the curtain over the parking lot window was closed, and she was not looking, and the car sat where it sat and waited. 7 days, Silas had been told. He intended to need fewer than 3. The first day passed without incident. The second day, Elena's downstairs neighbor, a retired man named Bert, who smelled of pipe tobacco and left his door open when the weather was warm, knocked on her door at 7 in the morning to tell her that someone had been asking about her at the building entrance the previous night. A man, polite, said he was an old friend trying to reconnect. Bert had not given him anything because Bert, who had lived in this building for 19 years and had developed strong instincts about the specific category of polite men who showed up at 7-story walk-ups asking questions, had told him he didn't know the name. Elena thanked him, closed the door, stood with her back against it and her eyes on the middle of the room. She called Mara. Mara didn't answer. She called twice more, then stopped, because calling repeatedly was the kind of thing that made fear compound itself. And she was trying very hard to manage the fear in measured doses because she was 15 weeks pregnant and alone in an apartment on the 4th floor of a building with a broken elevator, and losing her composure was not something she could afford. She packed a bag. Not everything, just the things that mattered. The ultrasound photos, all 4 of them, in a folded envelope, her documents, her medication, the cash she kept in the lining of the winter coat she'd brought from Westport. She set the bag by the door and sat on the edge of the bed and thought clearly and carefully about what her options were. She was still thinking when the door to the stairwell at the end of the corridor opened and she heard footsteps she did not recognize, heavier than Bert, more deliberate than the young woman in 4C who always took the stairs 2 at a time. And she picked up her bag and went to the window over the parking lot and opened it. The fire escape was there. She had checked it the first week, the way she checked exits whenever she was somewhere new. A habit she had developed in the first year of her marriage that she had never examined too closely because examining it would have meant acknowledging things she wasn't ready to acknowledge. She went down the fire escape in her coat with her bag over one shoulder and her hand on the cold iron railing, moving carefully because the stairs were wet from a rain she had slept through, And she did not run because running on wet iron 4 floors up while 15 weeks pregnant was the kind of decision that ended badly. She moved steadily. She did not look up. She was on the second-floor landing when she heard the window of her apartment open above her. She kept moving. She reached the street at the side of the building and turned left without hesitating and walked 3 blocks before she allowed herself to take out her phone. Her hands were not shaking. She was slightly surprised by this. She called the one number she had not yet used. Cassian answered before the second ring. "Someone's watching the apartment," she said. No preamble. No softening. "Not your people?" A beat of silence. Short but loaded. "No. I just came down the fire escape. I'm on Farrell Street, the corner of Farrell and Ninth." Another beat. She could hear something change in his breathing, a shift in the quality of the silence around him, like a room clearing. "Don't move," he said. 12 minutes. He made it in 9. The black SUV pulled to the curb and the door opened and Elena got in and did not look at him right away, which was the right instinct because she needed approximately 4 seconds to arrange her face into something that was not relief. And she had promised herself, in the bathroom mirror of the apartment on the 4th floor, in the car on the way from the clinic 3 weeks ago, in 100 small private moments since, that she would not give him relief. Not yet. Not before things had been said that needed saying. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." He looked at her the way he looked at things he was assessing for damage, quickly, thoroughly, from the face down. She let him do it. He nodded once, then said something quietly to the driver, and the car moved. "How long has someone been watching you?" he said. "I don't know. At least since last night." She kept her eyes forward. "Bert, my downstairs neighbor, saw someone at the entrance. And then this morning I heard someone in the corridor who wasn't a resident." Description. "I didn't see them. I heard the footsteps and I left." She glanced at him sideways. "I wasn't going to open the door and check." Something moved across his face. Not quite what she would have called admiration. More like recognition. The expression of a man who knows a correct decision when he sees one. "I need to take you somewhere safe," he said. "I know." "Elena." He stopped, started again. "I know you don't want to be—" "I said I know, Cassian." She looked at him directly for the first time. He looked like he had not been sleeping. There were specific signs she recognized. The jaw set a certain way, the particular flatness around his eyes that appeared when he had been running on caffeine and will for too many days in a row. She looked away before she could feel too much about it. "Let's deal with the immediate problem first." He nodded, pulled out his phone. She did not hear most of what he said into it because she was watching the city move past outside the window, calculating what had just happened. Someone had been watching the apartment. Not Cassian's people. Then whose? And how long had they known where she was? And why now? Why move now, with exactly 5 days left before she had agreed to see him? The timing was too precise to be coincidence. She pressed her hand flat to her stomach under the line of her coat. The baby, their son, she had been thinking of him as their son even though she had not yet said it to anyone, even Mara, was quiet, as he always was in the mornings. She had learned his rhythms in the past 2 weeks. He was most active in the evenings, when she was trying to sleep. He was still now. She let that steadiness anchor her. The baby was still. She could be still. "Okay," Cassian said, ending the call. "I'm taking you to a house in Fairfield. It's not on record under anything connected to me. You'll be—" "Before we go anywhere," Elena said, "I need to tell you something." He looked at her. She reached into the inner pocket of her coat and took out the folded envelope and opened it and handed him the earliest ultrasound photo. The one from 12 weeks. The one she had been carrying to his hotel on the morning everything ended. He took it, looked at it. The quality of his stillness changed in a way that she had not predicted and could not have predicted, because she had imagined his reaction many times in the past weeks, and none of the versions she had rehearsed looked like this. He went absolutely motionless, not the controlled stillness of a man managing his reaction. Something else. Something that did not look managed at all. 15 weeks, she said. I was coming to tell you. That morning at the hotel. I came to surprise you." He looked at the photo for a very long time. When he finally looked up, his eyes were different. Something had moved through them and left a watermark. "Elena, I'm not telling you so that you'll feel worse," she said. "I'm telling you because you needed to know, and because I was wrong to wait this long. Whatever happens between us, he's yours. He deserved to have his father know he exists." Cassian looked back at the photo. His hand, she noticed, was not entirely steady. "A son," he said. Not a question, just the word placed carefully in the air between them, like something that needed space around it. "A son," she said. The SUV moved through the city, and neither of them spoke for a long time, and the silence this time was of an entirely different quality than all the silences that had come before it. But the house in Fairfield was a 4-bedroom property on 2 acres, accessed by a private road, registered to a holding company that had been registered to another holding company for 8 years. Cassian had bought it as a contingency 7 years ago and had never needed to use it. It had been maintained and stocked and checked quarterly by a man named Doyle, who asked no questions and appeared to have no opinions. Elena walked through it once, checked the exits, noted the sight lines from the main windows, and said nothing except to ask whether the landline worked. It did. She unpacked her bag into the bedroom at the back of the house and came back to the kitchen and made tea and sat at the table. Cassian was on the phone again. He had been on the phone for most of the drive and for the 40 minutes since they arrived. She could hear fragments from the next room. Not words, just tone. The clipped, pressurized cadence of a man issuing instructions to people who understood the stakes of getting them wrong. He came into the kitchen and sat across from her. "My people didn't put anyone on your building," he said. "I need you to understand that." "I believe you." He looked at her like he wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. "I believe you that the woman was staged," she said. "I believed you on the phone, actually. She wrapped both hands around her mug. "It doesn't make the other things less true." "I know." He said it without qualification, which surprised her more than anything else he had said that morning. No defense, no pivot to the evidence, just, "I know," delivered in the voice of a man who had been sitting with something uncomfortable long enough that arguing against it no longer seemed like an option. "Then who?" she said. "I'm working on that." "Cassian." Her voice sharpened. "Someone was watching my apartment. Someone who knew where I was. Someone who knows enough about your operation to manufacture a false identity with a monogrammed shirt. This isn't abstract. That's our son." Something hardened in his jaw. "I know." "So who?" He looked at the table. For a man who rarely looked away from anything, this was significant. "I have a name I'm not ready to say yet. Because if I'm wrong, it creates a problem I can't undo. And if I'm right," he stopped. "If I'm right, it's worse than wrong." She studied him. "How long have you known this name?" "I don't know it. I suspect it." "How long have you suspected it?" A silence. 4 days. 4 days. She did the arithmetic quietly. 4 days, which was before she had agreed to see him, which meant he had been sitting on this suspicion while calling her, while agreeing to wait a week, while driving to Fairfield with a face that showed nothing. "Who is it?" she said. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him calculating. Not whether to trust her, she didn't think it was that. Something else. The particular calculation of a man deciding how much of a terrible thing to put in front of someone he was trying to protect. "Silas," he said. The name landed in the kitchen like something dropped from a height. Elena had met Silas Romano perhaps a dozen times across 4 years of marriage. He had always been correct with her, not warm. Silas was not a warm man, but correct. Attentive in the specific way of someone who has learned that attentiveness is useful. He had come to their wedding. He had sent flowers when she mentioned once, in passing, that she liked peonies, and she had thought at the time that it was a thoughtful gesture and had not thought about it much after that. "Tell me why," she said. Cassian's hands were flat on the table. She noticed the knuckles, old scars, poorly healed, the record of a man who had solved problems with his body before he learned to solve them otherwise. "His brother was killed 11 years ago," he said, "by my father's order." I didn't know about it until 2 years after the fact. I've never been certain whether Silas knows that I know. And you kept him. He was loyal, or performed loyalty well enough that the difference didn't matter. He paused. In my world, that's usually enough. He's been with you 11 years, she said, working through it, which means he's been planning this for possibly all of it. The flatness in Cashin's voice was specific. The flatness of a man who has already done the full calculation and is now living inside the number it produced. Everything I trusted him with, every decision he was close to, every piece of information he had access to. Elena sat with that. The scope of it. 11 years of proximity. 11 years of a man standing at Cassian's shoulder with a reason to want him destroyed, watching and waiting, and building something piece by piece with the patience of someone who understood that the most devastating revenge is not quick. The accounts, she said. Something was assembling itself. You said there were financial irregularities. He looked at her sharply. You mentioned it on the phone. Silas flagged something in the Western accounts. He flagged it, Cassian said slowly, so that I would look at it, so that I'd be distracted looking at the accounts while... He stopped. She watched him put it together in real time, watched something move behind his eyes. While the hotel, the woman... He stood up from the table abruptly and took 3 steps toward the window and stopped with his back to her. He used the investigation to run the investigation. He told me he was looking for who staged the hotel room while he was the one who staged it. He controlled what I was looking at and what I wasn't. He turned around. His face had changed. Not rage. Not yet. Something anterior to rage, the thing that comes before it, when a man realizes the dimensions of how completely he has been played. He's been managing my search, Cassian said. For 3 weeks I've been hunting this with his help, and he's been... His phone rang. He looked at the screen. His jaw tightened. Silas. He answered it. Elena watched his face. Cass. Silas's voice was audible from across the table, not clearly but enough. The familiar tone, easy, professional. I've got something on the hotel, woman. I think we have a break. Can you come in? Cassian's eyes were on Elena. She held his gaze and gave him nothing. No direction, no expression. This was his decision. She knew better than to make it for him. Where? Cassian said. Carmine Street. 1 hour. I'll be there. He ended the call. The kitchen was very quiet. You're going, Elena said. Yes. He'll know something is different. The moment he sees your face, no, he won't. Cassian's voice had gone to a register she had heard only rarely across 4 years, and each time she had been grateful it was not directed at her. Low. Very controlled. The voice of something that is closed around its target. I've been looking at his face for 11 years. He can look at mine for 1 more hour. He moved toward the door, stopped, turned back. Doyle is outside. He doesn't leave this property. He looked at her, not at her face, or not only at her face, at her in the full sense. I will be back. Cassian. She said it before she had decided to. He stopped. Be careful. Not for me. For... She touched her hand to her stomach. Not dramatically, just the gesture, small and honest. He looked at her hand, then at her face. Something in him shifted. Not softened, that wasn't the right word. Realigned, like weight redistributing. I'll be back, he said again, and left. Silas was already at the table in the back room of the restaurant on Carmine Street when Cassian arrived. He had coffee in front of him and a folder to his left, and the expression of a man who is comfortable in a room he has prepared, which was the first thing Cassian registered and filed. Sit down, Silas said. Cassian sat. He did not take coffee. The woman from the hotel, Silas said, opening the folder. Her real name is Daria Moss, freelance. She's been used by 2 other operations in the past 3 years for exactly this kind of placement. Manufactured scenarios for blackmail or leverage. We got her through a contact in Baltimore. He slid a photograph across. Whoever hired her paid through 3 layers of shell accounts, which is what took so long to... What's at the end of the shell accounts? Cassian said. Silas looked up. We haven't gotten there yet. You've had 3 weeks. These things take... Silas. Cassian said his name the way you say the name of a man you are watching very carefully. Not loud, not threatening, just precise. Where does the money come from? A beat. 1 second. Silas had very good control. But 1 second was enough, and Cassian had spent 11 years learning the specific rhythm of this man's silences. I'm still working on that, Silas said. Let me help you. Cassian leaned forward. His hands were flat on the table between them. I pulled the Western accounts myself last night, the ones you flagged 3 weeks ago. And I found something interesting, the irregularity you brought to my attention, the one that's been keeping my attention on the financial side while you managed everything else. He paused. It's not an irregularity. It's a mechanism, a routing structure that's been in place for 14 months, drawing small amounts from 6 different accounts into a single holding position that doesn't appear in any of our standard reports. Silas's face had not changed. This was impressive in a way that made Cassian's stomach cold. You built it carefully, Cassian said, but you built it while I was watching other things, and I wasn't watching it because I trusted you to watch it for me. The restaurant around them was empty at this hour. 2 of Cassian's men were at the front, 2 more at the back entrance. Silas had come alone, which told Cassian something about either Silas's confidence or Silas's arrogance, and he was no longer certain there was a difference. That's a serious accusation, Silas said. His voice had not changed register, still even, still professional. Yes, Cassian agreed. It is. You're going to need more than a routing structure. I have more. Cassian reached into his jacket and set his own folder on the table, thinner than Silas's, but what was in it had taken his accountant 4 hours to construct and another 2 hours to verify. The identity used to build Claire Vander, the woman at the hotel, was purchased through a broker in Delaware. The broker's operating account received a wire transfer 14 months ago from one of the holding positions in the structure I just described. He tapped the folder once. You paid for the identity that ruined my marriage 18 months before you used it. The silence that followed was of a completely different quality than all the silences in the room before it. Silas looked at the folder, then at Cassian, and something happened in his face that Cassian had never seen there in 11 years. The performance dropped, not all at once but in layers, like paint blistering from heat, and underneath it was something raw and long-standing and entirely without apology. Your father killed my brother, Silas said. You knew. You've known for 2 years. Yes. And you kept me. Yes. You kept me. Silas said it again, and the repetition was not confusion. It was the particular emphasis of a man restating something that constitutes a crime. You knew what my brother meant to me, and you kept me close, and you watched me, and you said nothing, and you thought that was... What? Mercy? I thought it was trust, Cassian said. I was wrong. You were wrong about a lot of things. Silas leaned back. His hands were on the table, unhurried, the hands of a man who made a decision a long time ago and has been living inside it since. She was going to give you everything, a son, a real life, and you would have slept through it. You would have let it happen around you and been present for none of it, and she would have spent 20 years loving a man who was always halfway out the door. He tilted his head slightly. I just moved the timeline. You put men outside her apartment, Cassian said. His voice was very low. She's 15 weeks pregnant. Something moved across Silas's face, gone before Cassian could read it. I didn't know that. You're lying. I'm not. And this, strangely, had the ring of truth. Silas's one genuine surprise in the whole conversation, a single thread of something real in the performance. He hadn't known. The men outside the apartment had been sent to prevent Elena from becoming a reconciliation before Silas was ready, not knowing what they were threatening. It didn't make it better. It made it worse in a different way. Cassian stood up from the table. Where are you going? Silas said. To end this. Silas reached inside his jacket. Cassian's 2 men were through the door before the hand completed its motion, and the room tightened into the specific configuration of men and angles that Cassian had navigated so many times it had its own geometry in his memory. But Silas did not bring out a weapon. He brought out a phone, set it on the table face up. On the screen was a text message. 2 lines. She left the house. We have her. Cassian looked at the phone, then at Silas. The room did not spin. The room was absolutely still in the way that rooms are still in the moment before something irreversible happens, and Cassian stood in the center of it, and felt something close in him that had been open his entire adult life, some last remaining door through which mercy, patience, and the habits of civilization could still enter. It closed. "Where?" he said. Silas looked at him across the table with 11 years of planning behind his eyes and said nothing. And Cassian understood in that moment that the man he had always been, the man who built carefully, who operated through intermediaries, who kept his hands at a certain distance from the worst things done in his name, was no longer sufficient for what came next. What came next required something older and less careful, something that lived beneath the architecture of the empire and the strategy and the controlled silences, something that had no interest in being reasonable. He looked at Silas, and the decision was already made before he knew he was making it, the way the most consequential decisions always are, not chosen so much as arrived at, the destination revealed only when you are already standing in it with no road behind you. Cassian hit Silas once, not with the controlled, deliberate force of a man who has done violence professionally for 20 years. With his fist and his weight and everything behind it, the way you hit something when the performance of being a certain kind of man has finally exhausted itself, and what's left underneath is just the animal fact of rage. Silas's head snapped back, and the chair went sideways, and one of Cassian's men moved forward instinctively, and Cassian said, "Don't," in a voice that stopped the man where he stood. Silas was on the floor, blood from his lip. He touched it with 2 fingers and looked at his hand, and then looked up at Cassian with an expression that was not fear and not surprise and not pain exactly. Something more like satisfaction. The expression of a man who has been waiting a long time for the real conversation to begin. "Where is she?" Cassian said. Silas said nothing. Cassian crouched down in front of him. This brought them to eye level, which was deliberate. He wanted Silas looking at his face. He wanted there to be no ambiguity about what he was seeing there. "Silas," very quiet, "I have known you for 11 years. I know the way you think. I know how you build things, how you construct contingencies, how you never move without 2 exits planned." He let that sit for a moment. "I know you planned for this conversation. You planned for the moment I found out. And whatever you planned, whatever leverage you think you have, whatever arrangement you made that you believe keeps you safe right now, I need you to understand that it is insufficient." Silas looked at him steadily. "You won't find her in time. That's not a location." "No," Silas agreed. "It's not." Cassian stood up. He turned to the taller of his 2 men, a man named Reardon who had worked for him for 6 years and who possessed, among other qualities, an exceptional memory for operational detail. "The holding houses," Cassian said. "Everything we've used in the last 3 years that Silas had access to. List them." Reardon began. 7 locations. Cassian listened to each one and ranked them in his mind by probability: proximity to the city, accessibility without drawing attention, structural capacity to hold someone without the neighbors asking questions. By the 5th address, something was already resolved in him. He looked back at Silas. Silas had not moved from the floor. He was sitting with his back against the overturned chair, legs extended, blood drying on his lip, watching Cassian with the composed attention of a chess player watching an opponent work through the middle game. "The warehouse on Underworld Road," Cassian said. Something happened in Silas's eyes. Almost nothing. A single frame of adjustment, quickly suppressed. But Cassian had been watching this man's face for 11 years, and he caught it the way you catch emotion in your peripheral vision, not by looking directly at it, but by having been trained to notice. "Get him up," Cassian said to Reardon. "He comes with us." The warehouse on Underworld Road was 23 minutes from the restaurant on Carmine Street. Cassian made it in 16. He drove himself, which he had not done in years. The kind of tactical decision that bypasses the rational mind entirely and comes directly from the body's understanding that speed matters more than protocol. Reardon followed in a second car with Silas. 2 more men in a third. Cassian called ahead. Not to anyone at the warehouse. He didn't know who was at the warehouse or whose loyalty they currently operated under, but to his man Torres, who had been with him for 8 years and had never been in the same room as Silas in a professional capacity, which made him the most trustworthy asset available. "Underworld Road," he said when Torres answered. "I need eyes on it before I arrive. Tell me what you see." "Give me 4 minutes." "You have 2." He drove. The city gave way to the kind of neighborhood that existed at the edges of the city's attention. Light industrial, sporadic streetlights, buildings that served functions that didn't benefit from visibility. He knew this district. He had known it for 20 years. He had a specific memory of being 23 years old and standing outside a building 3 blocks from the Delham Road warehouse in the rain, waiting for a meeting that would change the trajectory of his life. He had been afraid then. He remembered the specific quality of that fear, young and cold and laced with the possibility of failure. He was not afraid now. He was something else, something that had no name in the vocabulary of ordinary experience. It was the state he had entered perhaps 6 or 7 times across 20 years, the state where fear and calculation and the normal human resistance to irrevocable action had all burned away, and what was left was pure and clarifying and terrifying to everyone in proximity. Torres called back in 90 seconds. 2 cars outside, 1 man at the front entrance, visible, lights on the ground floor. I count movement through the window, at least 3 inside, maybe more. Anyone on the roof? Can't confirm, possibly. The loading entrance at the back. Gated, padlocked from what I can see. I'll come through the back. He thought for 1 second. Torres, is she? I can't confirm from this distance. Get closer. A pause. Footsteps. The sound of Torres moving. Cassian turned onto Delham Road and killed his headlights 2 blocks out and drove the rest of the way on the orange spill of the streetlights. There's a woman inside, Torres said. Ground floor, east side. She's seated. She's... A pause that lasted too long. She's upright. She looks okay from what I can see. The thing in Cassian's chest that had been wound to maximum tension for the past 53 minutes released approximately 5% of its pressure. Enough to breathe, not enough to slow down. He parked. Got out. The night air was cold and smelled of diesel and standing water. He moved around the perimeter of the building at a pace that looked unhurried from a distance and covered ground quickly. The back gate was padlocked with a chain, heavy gauge, the kind that takes time. He didn't have time. He had the gun from his jacket, and he shot the padlock twice and the chain gave and he pushed the gate open and moved through. Behind him, Reardon's car was pulling up at the front. He had 30 seconds before everything began. He came through the loading entrance low and fast with the gun up, and the geometry of the space resolved itself in front of him. The way spaces always did when his mind was running at this particular frequency, instantly, completely, the way a map downloads rather than builds incrementally. High ceilings. Concrete floor. Machinery stacked along the left wall. A partition wall across the middle of the space with light coming through the gap at the bottom. 1 man between him and the partition, young, turned at the wrong moment. He had been facing the front, expecting the disruption to come from there, which was the point of the 2-pronged approach, and the half-second of reorientation was enough. Cassian hit him at the temple with the grip of the gun rather than shooting him, which was a decision made in a fraction of a second on the basis of noise management and the preference for leaving people alive when it was operationally possible. The man went down. Through the gap in the partition, 2 more men on the other side. They had heard something, not enough to have their weapons fully raised, but enough to have their hands moving. The one on the left was faster, and Cassian shot him in the shoulder rather than center mass, because center mass was final, and he still did not know the full shape of what Silas had set in motion, and Deadman answered nothing. The one on the right stopped when he saw the one on the left go down and did the math and raised his hands. On the floor, Cassian said. The man got on the floor. Elena was at the far end of the space, seated in a metal chair with her wrists zip-tied to the armrests. Not injured, from what he could see. Her posture was straight, not the slumped posture of someone in shock or physical distress. Her chin was up. She was watching him cross the floor toward her with an expression that was part relief and part something harder. The expression of a person who has been managing their fear with great discipline for some time and is now having to manage the additional complexity of being rescued by the person they are also furious with. He crouched in front of her, pulled a folding knife from his pocket and cut the zip ties. Her hands came free, and she pressed them together for a moment, circulation, and then she looked at him and said, "How many were there?" 3 in here, more out front. From the other side of the building, he could hear the sounds of Reardon and Torres working through the front entrance. Not gunshots. Not yet. the sounds of rapid, controlled movement. Are you hurt? No. She flexed her hands. They didn't touch me. I think they were waiting for... She stopped. Something moved through her face. Silas. He's in a car outside. Her eyes sharpened. He was going to come here himself. Yes. He stood and offered her his hand. She took it and stood, and he registered the weight and warmth of her grip and did not examine it because he did not have the bandwidth to examine it and also function, and functioning was what the next 20 minutes required. Can you walk? I've been sitting in a chair for 2 hours, not running a marathon. She let go of his hand. I can walk. From the front of the building came a short, sharp sound, not quite a shot, something impacting something, and then silence, and then Torres's voice calling clear. Cassian guided Elena toward the loading entrance, his hand at the small of her back without thinking about it, the gesture of a body that had spent 4 years learning her specific dimensions and had not unlearned them. They came through the back gate and Elena stopped and took in 3 full breaths of the night air like someone surfacing. Cassian watched her do it. Her hands were at her sides and her eyes were closed for exactly those 3 breaths, and then they opened, and she looked at him. I need to sit down, she said. Not because I'm going to fall. I just need to sit down. He opened the car door. She got in. He crouched in the open doorway so they were eye level. Her face in the low light was composed and exhausted and carrying something he recognized, the specific fatigue of a person who has been frightened and has not allowed themselves to be frightened, which takes more out of you than the fear itself. I'm okay, she said, as if she'd read the specific thing he was looking at. I know. He wasn't entirely sure that was true, but she needed him to say it, and he needed to say something that wasn't the actual content of what was moving through him, which was too large and too unmanageable for a parking area behind a warehouse on Delham Road. I need you to stay in the car for 10 more minutes. She looked at him steadily. Silas. Yes. What are you going to do? He didn't answer immediately. He looked at her face, the set of it, the particular quality of the question, which was not naive. She knew what he was capable of. She had always known. It was one of the facts of the life she had married into, something she had made her private accommodation with in the first year, something that had sat between them always, usually unnamed. I'm going to finish it, he said. She held his gaze for a long moment. Cassian. Her voice had changed, lower, more careful. There's a different way to finish it. Elena, I know what you want to do. I understand why. Her hands were in her lap, steady. But he's not worth what it would cost you. What it would cost... She didn't finish the sentence. She touched her hand to her stomach instead, the same small gesture from the car that morning, and it landed in him with more force than the actual words. He looked at her hand, then her face. Stay in the car, he said, and stood up. Silas was in the back seat of Reardon's car with his hands zip-tied, a symmetry that Cassian noted without comment, and the kind of stillness that had once read as professionalism and now read as something else. Something that had been sustained too long and was beginning to show its true composition. Cassian opened the door and got in beside him. Reardon and the driver got out without being asked. The 2 of them sat in the back of the car in the dark on Delham Road, and the silence between them was not like any of the silences they had shared across 11 years. Those silences had been professional silences, comfortable silences, the silences of 2 men who understood each other's operational rhythms. This one was the silence of what they actually were to each other, finally, without the architecture of loyalty and shared history between them. She's not hurt, Cassian said. Silas looked forward through the windshield. Good, good. You didn't know about the pregnancy? No. But you would have done it anyway. Not a question. Silas turned his head, looked at Cassian directly. I didn't want to hurt her, he said. I never wanted to hurt her. She wasn't the target. She was in the chair. As leverage, she would have been released. When? The word came out sharp. When exactly was she going to be released, Silas? After you'd finished destroying everything between us. After she'd miscarried from the stress. After you'd confirmed that she'd taken the baby and disappeared and I had nothing left to... He stopped. His voice had been rising and he brought it back down with an effort that was physically visible. You don't get to define the limits of what you were willing to do to her. That's not your call to make. Silas said nothing. His jaw was set. My father killed your brother, Cassian said. I know, I've known. And I kept you because I believed that the work we'd done together meant something. I believed it had created something real that was separate from the history. He paused. Was any of it real? Silas was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was in a voice that had some texture in it for the first time, something human and old and tired. Some of it, he said, more than I planned for. He looked at his hands, bound in his lap. That made it harder, not easier. You did it anyway. Yes. Cassian looked out the windshield. Somewhere behind them, Torres was securing the front of the building and Reardon was organizing the situation into something manageable. The operational part of him was already running triage, what needed to be locked down, who needed to be relocated, what the exposure looked like across the network after tonight. 11 years. The exposure was significant. The accounts, Cassian said. The full structure. I need everything. You'll need to find it yourself. Silas. I'm not helping you clean up what I built. Not defiant, just flat. The statement of a man who has accepted the situation and is choosing the only remaining ground he can hold. I built it carefully. It'll take you time, but you'll find it. Cassian looked at him. For a long moment he held the look, and in that moment he was aware of something he had not expected. Not forgiveness, not even close to forgiveness, but a specific and unexpected clarity about what Silas was and had been, which was a man who had kept his wound so long it had become his identity, who had organized his entire professional life around the single architecture of revenge, and who had been, in his own warped way, as trapped by it as anyone. This did not make him sympathetic. It made him pitiable, which was worse. You're going to spend the rest of your life somewhere I put you, Cassian said. And you're going to spend it knowing that she's alive, that the child is alive, that everything you did, all of it, 11 years of it, produced nothing that lasts. He held Silas's gaze. I won't kill you. That would make this about my anger. This is going to be about the rest of your life. He got out of the car. The night air hit him, and he stood for a moment with his hands at his sides and his eyes on the warehouse building and its ordinary, indifferent face. His shoulder ached. He had not noticed until now that at some point in the past 20 minutes, he had taken impact somewhere, a glancing contact with a door frame or a wall, nothing serious but real, the body making its accounting. He rolled the shoulder once, noted it, set it aside. He walked back to his car. Elena was in the passenger seat where he had left her. She watched him come across the parking area, watched the way he moved, the set of his shoulders, the particular quality of his hands at his sides. He got in. The car was warm. She was looking at him. Is it over? She said. The immediate part. He started the car. There's a longer part. It's going to take months to work through what he built inside the organization. The financial structure, the compromised relationships, He stopped. Aware that he was doing the thing he had always done, defaulting to the operational, using the language of logistics to avoid the language of everything else. He made himself stop. We're safe. You're safe. The rest, he exhaled. The rest, I'll handle. She looked at him for a moment. Something was moving through her face that he could not fully read. Then she turned forward and looked through the windshield. Then drive, she said. He drove. They were 3 minutes from the warehouse when Elena, looking straight ahead, said quietly, I felt him move tonight, while I was in the chair, first time. A pause. I didn't want that to be the first time. Cassian's hands tightened on the wheel. He didn't trust his voice for a moment. He let a beat pass. Tell me when he does it again, he said. She turned her head and looked at him. Her expression was unreadable in the moving light. Then she turned back to the windshield and said nothing, and the city unrolled before them through the glass, and Cassian drove toward it with the awareness, clean and specific and impossible to look at directly, like light after dark, that whatever came next, whatever she decided, whatever the long and difficult road of earning anything looked like, he was going to be on it. Not because he deserved to be, because she and the child they had made together were on it, and there was no version of himself he could live in that was not moving in the same direction as they were, even if she needed him 20 paces behind for a long time yet. His phone lit up on the console. Torres. The message read, Front clear, 5 secured. Reardon has the primary. What do you want done with the rest? He picked up the phone one-handed and typed back, Hold them. Nobody moves until I give the word. He set the phone down, looked at the road. Behind them, Delham Road and its warehouse, and Silas Romano, and 11 years of careful, patient destruction were receding in the mirror. Ahead, the city was doing what cities always did at this hour, burning its lights against the dark with no awareness of what had just happened inside it, no acknowledgement of the specific violence and specific tenderness that had coexisted in the same 2-hour stretch of an otherwise ordinary night. Elena had her hand resting at her stomach again. She was not aware of doing it, or maybe she was and had stopped caring whether he saw. He saw. He said nothing, because there was nothing to say yet that would not come out wrong, and he had been saying the wrong things for 4 years, and the one thing he understood clearly, in the specific and humbling clarity of a man who has just run through a warehouse to bring his pregnant wife home, was that the next thing he said to her needed to be right. So he drove. And he let the silence be what it was. Not empty, not comfortable, but inhabited, shared, 2 people in a moving car in the dark, with everything still ahead of them, and the worst of what was behind them, finally done. The city rose around them. His knuckles on the wheel were white with the effort of holding everything at exactly the right distance, close enough to feel, far enough to function, and ahead, through the windshield, the lights of the highway offered the one thing he had not had in 3 weeks. A direction. They stayed in the Fairfield house for 11 days, not because it was safe enough. It was. Cassian had 3 men on the property around the clock, and Torres had swept the perimeter twice, but because neither of them was ready for what came after. This was not discussed. It was simply understood the way things are understood between 2 people who have lived inside each other's rhythms long enough that the bones know what the mouth hasn't said yet. Doyle stocked the kitchen without being asked. Elena cooked because cooking was something to do with her hands, and her hands needed occupation, and the alternative was sitting in the rooms of the house thinking about the chair in the warehouse on Delham Road, and the zip ties and the specific quality of the fear she had managed with such discipline that she had not allowed herself to fully feel it until the 3rd morning in Fairfield, when she woke at 4 a.m. and sat on the edge of the bed and shook for 20 minutes without sound. Cassian was asleep on the other side of the bed. She had not asked him to be there, and he had not asked permission. On the first night he had settled into the chair in the corner of the room, which was both unnecessary and transparent, and she had looked at him in the chair and said, "This is a 4-bedroom house." And he had said, "I know." And she had said, "You're not sleeping in a chair." And he had moved to the bed and kept to his side with the careful deliberateness of a man who understood that the distance between them was not a failure of proximity, but of time, and that the only way to reduce it was to hold it steady and not push. So she shook on the edge of the bed at 4 a.m., and he woke. She felt the mattress shift, the almost imperceptible change in his breathing that meant he had moved from sleep to alert in the specific way men of his background always did, instantly, completely, no gradation. And he said nothing for a moment. Then he sat up. He didn't touch her. He sat beside her on the edge of the bed in the dark with his feet on the floor and his elbows on his knees, and he stayed there while she shook, and then stopped shaking, and then he said quietly, "I've got you." Not "you're safe," or "it's over," or any of the things people say to fill the silence of someone else's fear. Just that. Present tense. Unqualified. She pressed her hands flat to her thighs and breathed until the breathing was normal, and she did not lean into him, but she did not move away either, and after a while they both lay back down and she did not sleep again, but the dark was less dense than it had been, and that was enough. On the 4th day, Cassian drove back to the city alone. He had told her he needed 3 days. He took 4. In that time he dismantled, with the systematic efficiency of a man who built things and therefore understood how they came apart, the financial structure that Silas had been constructing inside his organization for 14 months. His accountant worked 72 hours across 4 days. 2 of the shell companies were dissolved. 3 compromised accounts were frozen, and the funds rerouted through mechanisms that Silas had no knowledge of because Cassian had built them after Silas, before any of this, in the routine paranoia of a man who never fully trusted any single person with everything. The irony of that particular habit did not escape him. He also made 3 calls that needed to be made in person, to men in Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Miami who had been doing business with his organization for years, and who had, to varying degrees, also been doing business with structures that Silas had quietly built parallel to his. These conversations were not pleasant. Two of them required concessions. One of them required the kind of specific demonstration of consequence that Cassian had not needed to perform himself in several years, and which he performed with the controlled, joyless precision of a man who understands that certain messages cannot be delegated. He came back to Fairfield on a Thursday evening with a split lip and a bruised rib that he had taped himself in the car because stopping at a medical facility was not an option, and Elena saw it immediately. She saw everything now, watched him the way you watch something you've been negligent about and are trying to recalibrate, and she said, "Sit down," in a voice that admitted no argument, and he sat at the kitchen table and let her look at the split lip and the way he held his right side. "Tape," she said. "Already done." "Show me." He lifted his shirt. She looked at the tape job without touching it, her face making no particular judgment. Then she looked at his face. "Is it over?" she said. The same question she had asked in the car outside Delham Road. "The organizational part." "Yes." He lowered his shirt. "Silas has been transferred to a facility and he's secured. He won't be a problem." She studied him. "You didn't kill him." "No." "Why not?" He met her eyes. "Because you asked me not to." This landed between them. She held it for a moment, then turned to the sink and ran water over a cloth and brought it back and pressed it to his lip, not roughly but not gently either, with the particular competence of someone who has decided to do a thing and is doing it. He sat still and let her. "That's not the only reason," she said. A statement, not a question. "No, but it's the reason that was different from what I would have done otherwise." She pressed the cloth to his lip, and he watched her face at close range. The concentration in it, the lines around her eyes that were new since the last time he'd been this close, the specific way her jaw set when she was deciding something. She looked older than she had 4 months ago. She looked more like herself. "The business," she said. "What's left of it?" "Diminished. The parts I had to burn to clean out the infection." He stopped. "The organization is smaller than it was. Some relationships are gone. Some of what I spent 20 years building is—" He searched for the word that was honest. "Reduced." She took the cloth away, looked at his lip. The bleeding had stopped. "Are you—" She paused. He saw her choosing the form of the question. "Are you going to rebuild it?" "No." She looked at him directly. "I'm going to dismantle the rest of it," he said. "Legally where I can, through other means where I can't. It's going to take time. Some of what I built doesn't come apart cleanly. It has to be wound down slowly, or the structural collapse creates other problems." He held her gaze. "But no, I'm not going to rebuild it." "Why?" He looked at her hand, which was still holding the damp cloth, and at the slight curve of her stomach under her shirt, and at the kitchen of the house in Fairfield that smelled of the pasta she had made earlier, and the coffee that had been sitting too long, and the ordinary domestic details of a life being provisionally, carefully lived. "Because you were right," he said. "What you said on the phone, I built something that I was always halfway out the door of, and I used what I built to justify being halfway out, and that became the whole design, always another meeting, another problem, another emergency that required me instead of any of the 1,000 other things I should have been present for." He exhaled. "The organization didn't make me absent. I used it to be absent. Those are different things." She looked at him for a long time. Her face did not soften exactly, but something in it acknowledged that he had said something true, which was its own kind of movement. "That doesn't fix 4 years," she said. "I know." "Saying it doesn't fix it." "I know." He held her gaze without flinching from it. "I'm not asking you to forgive anything. I'm asking you to let me be in the same rooms as you and our son while I try to be worth the space." The word son moved across her face. It always did. He had noticed this in the past 4 days. The specific way the word landed on her, the small, involuntary thing that happened around her eyes whenever their child was made specific. She set the cloth on the table. "I'm going to bed," she said. He nodded. She walked to the door of the kitchen, stopped without turning around. "There's pasta on the stove," she said. "Don't leave the kitchen dirty." She left. He sat at the table and listened to her footsteps on the stairs, and when the sound stopped, he reached for the cloth she had left and folded it over the edge of the sink, and then he ate the pasta cold from the pot standing at the stove, because heating it meant waiting, and he was very tired, and then he washed the pot and the bowl and the fork and dried them and put them away. He stood in the clean kitchen for a moment in the quiet of the house and let the specific shape of the moment exist without trying to make it into anything larger than it was. Then he turned off the light and went upstairs. Luca Moretti was born on a Tuesday in March, 7 weeks after the night on Underworld Road, in a hospital in a mid-sized city 2 hours north of where any of this had happened, under conditions that were medically unremarkable and personally extraordinary. He weighed 7 pounds, 2 ounces. He had dark hair that lay flat against his skull and a face that was concentrated and deeply unimpressed with its circumstances, which Elena, exhausted and split open with love in a way she had not been prepared for by any of her prior experience of the world, said was exactly his father's face. Cassian, sitting beside the bed with the child in his arms for the first time, looked down at the concentrated, unimpressed face and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "He looks like you." "He has your exact expression," Elena said, "the one you make when someone is wasting your time." The expression Cassian was currently making was not that expression. She knew what it was. She had imagined it in those first weeks of the pregnancy before everything collapsed, when she had still been constructing the fantasy of telling him. She had imagined his face doing something it rarely did, the careful machinery of it going quiet and open. She had been right about that. She had not been right about the degree of it. She had not anticipated that Cassian Moretti, who had faced men with guns with less visible feeling than most people brought to difficult phone calls, would hold his newborn son for the first time and look like something inside him had been set down after a very long carry. He held the baby for 40 minutes without putting him down. When a nurse came to take Luca for routine measurements, Cassian tracked the nurse across the room with his eyes the entire time she had the baby, which Elena noticed and did not comment on because she had been doing the same thing. They did not go back to the house in Westport. This was Elena's decision, stated plainly and without negotiation, and Cassian accepted it without argument because the house in Westport was the house where she had spent 4 years learning to not mind things, and walking back into it would have been like asking someone who has healed from a particular wound to live inside the instrument that made it. They found a house in a smaller town 40 minutes north. 3 bedrooms, a yard, a street where other families lived and children left bicycles in driveways, and no one would know the specific history of the people who had moved in. Cassian bought it in both their names, which was itself a statement, and which Elena read correctly as such. He moved his remaining legal business operations to a firm managed by people he trusted to run them without him, which was a different kind of trust than the trust he had exercised toward Silas, and which he calibrated differently. He kept his phone. He kept certain relationships that were not cleanly separable from the world he was dismantling. This was the reality Elena had made her accommodation with, that it did not come apart overnight, that unwinding 20 years of architecture was not a switch but a process. But he was home for dinner. Not occasionally, not when the day permitted it. Home for dinner in the way that a man is home for dinner when it is the thing around which everything else is organized rather than the thing organized around everything else. She noticed. She did not say anything about it for the first 2 weeks. On the 3rd week she said, "You came home early today." And he said, "I had a call at 4 and moved it to tomorrow." And she said, "You didn't have to do that." And he said, "I know." And she said nothing else. And that was enough. And then it happened again and again. And the pattern began to accumulate the way patterns do. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the specific and undeniable way of days adding to days. He built the cradle himself. This was not something anyone asked him to do. He had no particular skill with woodworking. He had grown up in a world where things were bought, not made, where the demonstration of resources was more legible than the demonstration of effort. But he had found, in the weeks after Underworld Road and before Luca's birth, that his hands needed work that was not the work of his professional life, that the specific satisfaction of making something physical was different from any other kind of satisfaction he had access to, and that the difference mattered. He bought a book and lumber and the specific tools he needed from a hardware store where no one knew him, and he worked in the garage of the Fairfield house on the evenings when Elena was resting, and he made mistakes. 3, serious enough to require starting sections over, and he corrected them. The cradle that resulted was not artisan quality. The joints were slightly irregular on one side and the finish was uneven in the corner where he had rushed it on the last evening, because Luca was already 3 days past his due date, and Cassian had felt, irrationally but powerfully, that the cradle needed to be done before the baby arrived. Elena came into the garage the evening he finished it, stood looking at it for a moment, ran her hand along the side rail. "It's not level," she said. "I know, I'll fix the foot." She looked at it for another moment. "Don't," she said. Then she went back inside. He stood in the garage for a moment after she left. Something had moved through him at the word, the single syllable of it, and what it meant that she didn't want it fixed, and what it meant that she had come to look at it at all. He turned off the garage light and went inside. The conversation happened on a Sunday in June, when Luca was 11 weeks old and the summer had come properly. The kind of summer that arrived all at once in the way of that particular latitude. Suddenly warm, suddenly green, the yard outside the back window transformed overnight from the muddy promise of spring into something that looked like what Cassian had never particularly wanted, until now, when he wanted it with a straightforwardness that surprised him. Elena had put Luca down after his morning feed, and she came out to the back porch where Cassian was sitting with coffee, and she sat in the other chair, and they sat in the way they had been learning to sit together again. Not uncomfortable, not entirely easy, the way two people sit when they are rebuilding something and are honest enough with themselves to not pretend it's rebuilt yet. "I want to tell you something," she said. He waited. "I was angry with you before any of this happened." She was looking at the yard. "I want you to understand that. The hotel, the woman, the setup, Silas, all of that came after I was already angry. I had been angry for a long time, and I had not told you because I had decided somewhere along the way that telling you was pointless, that you weren't available for it." He held his coffee, said nothing. "That's not entirely fair," she said. "You were available. I just didn't believe you would receive it, and that's a different thing. That's something I did. I closed the channel, and then I blamed you for not sending anything through it." She paused. "I need to say that, because I spent a lot of time in those weeks, in the apartment, in the chair on Delham Road, in the car, building a version of events where I was simply the person that things were done to. And that's true, but it's not the whole truth. Elena, I'm not finished. Not sharp, just clear." He closed his mouth. "I also want to tell you that I see what you've been doing, since Fairfield, the dinners, the phone calls moved, the cradle." She finally looked at him. "I see it. I want you to know that, because I think you've been doing it without knowing whether I noticed, and I don't want you to carry that uncertainty longer than you need to." He looked at her. The morning light was doing something specific to her face. The angle of it, the way the summer had put color into her skin in the past 3 weeks, the fact that she was not wearing the specific expression she had worn for so long, the one she wore when she was managing herself in his presence, when she was deciding how much to show. She was not managing herself right now. She was just sitting in her chair with her coffee and looking at him and saying true things. "I noticed," she said. "I notice every time." She set her coffee down. "I'm not ready to call it forgiven. I don't know if that word is the right one, or if it's a word that applies cleanly to something this complicated, but I am—" She stopped, found the specific language. "I am willing to find out what we are now, who we are now, with all of this behind us." She looked at the yard. "I think we might be something I don't have a word for yet. Something that comes after the thing we were." Cassian set down his coffee. He looked at the yard too. The ordinary, sunlit, improbable yard of a house on a street where people left bicycles in driveways. "I'll take that," he said. She nodded, picked up her coffee. They sat in the Sunday morning quiet, and from inside the house came the small sound of Luca, not crying, just making the sounds he made when he was waking. Small, exploratory sounds, the sounds of a person who is new to the world and is taking its inventory. Elena started to stand. "I'll go," Cassian said. She looked at him. He was already up, already moving toward the back door. She watched him go through it, and she sat in the chair on the back porch and listened to the sounds of him in the house. The particular rhythm of his footsteps on the stairs, the slight creak of the nursery door, the specific quality of the quiet that followed, which was the quiet of a man picking up a child. Then Luca's sounds changed, became something settled and content, the sounds of a child who has been lifted into arms that are already familiar. She wrapped both hands around her mug. The morning was warm and the yard was green, and somewhere down the street a neighbor's dog was moving through its own morning with uncomplicated enthusiasm, and Elena Voss, who had grown up learning that feelings were private things, expensive things, kept folded inside the chest, let the moment be what it was, without folding it. Cassian learned his son's rhythms the way he had learned most things in his life, through close observation and the willingness to be wrong and try again. He learned that Luca was unhappy in the morning until his feet were warm, and that the specific motion of being carried on the left shoulder was preferable to the right, and that the sound of running water calmed him in a way that other sounds did not, and that his eyes, dark, considering, possessed of an attention that felt already deliberate, tracked movement with a focus that was both disconcerting and familiar. He did not know how to be a father. He knew this clearly and without self-deception, which was itself a different position than he had occupied for most of his life, where knowing things was the primary instrument of his safety. Here, not knowing was the starting position, and the requirement was simply to begin from it and stay present and not mistake the discomfort of not knowing for a reason to step back. He bathed his son on Thursday evenings. This had started because Elena's back had been aching in the third week, the specific complaint of a woman whose body was recovering from the work of birth. And Cassian had said, "I'll do it." And she had looked at him with the particular assessment of someone deciding whether to extend a provisional trust. And she had said, "Okay," and left the bathroom to him. The first bath had been a negotiation. Luca had opinions about temperature, about the specific angle of support, about the washcloth, and he communicated these opinions loudly and without ambiguity. Cassian worked through them with the same concentrated attention he had once applied to problems of a considerably more violent nature, and by the end of the bath, Luca was clean and complaining, and Cassian's shirt was soaked, and they looked at each other, the man and the 11-day-old person, with a mutual wariness that contained underneath it something that was already more than wariness. By the fifth Thursday, the bath had acquired a routine. By the eighth, Cassian was talking to Luca during it, not in the particular voice people use for babies, which he could not produce without feeling fraudulent, but in something closer to his normal voice, quieter, describing what he was doing as he did it. The water temperature, the washcloth, the specific smell of the soap that Elena had chosen, which was unscented, because she had read something about infant sensory development and had opinions about it that she had stated once without defending them because she had learned they were correct. Luca appeared to find this narration acceptable. The unraveling of the empire was not dramatic. It was paperwork and phone calls and a series of decisions made in offices and over dinners with lawyers who billed by the hour and understood more than they acknowledged. Some of the structures came apart cleanly. Some required the kind of persuasion that existed in the gray space between legal and otherwise. A few relationships had to be ended in ways that were not pleasant, and that required Cassian to be, one final time, the man he was winding down, being precise and unambiguous and specifically credible in his capacity for consequence. He did not enjoy this. He had, at various points in his life, found a certain satisfaction in that kind of precision, and the absence of that satisfaction told him something about how thoroughly the axis of his life had shifted. The thing that had once given him the particular pleasure of competence now just felt like the cleanup work that it was, necessary, finite, and getting done. Torres stayed with him through the dismantling. This was Torres's choice, stated simply and without sentiment in a conversation that lasted less than 4 minutes, and Cassian accepted it as the specific form of loyalty that it was. Not a loyalty to what he had built, but to him, the man who had built it, which was a distinction that mattered. Reardon moved to Baltimore with severance that was sufficient, and the understanding that certain things would not follow him there. Doyle, who had maintained the Fairfield house for 7 years, and who had asked no questions through all of this, was given the house itself, which surprised him into speechlessness for a moment that Cassian found, for the first time in a long time, genuinely funny. The last meeting with his lawyer lasted 3 hours. At the end of it, the remaining legitimate holdings had been transferred to a management structure that required none of his operational involvement. The less legitimate elements were as wound down as they were going to get, which was not entirely but significantly, which was the honest answer to what 20 years of that kind of building could be reduced to in 9 months. He drove home from that meeting on a Wednesday afternoon in November, with Luca's car seat visible in the back mirror and the radio on a station he had never listened to before Luca, which played the kind of music that was selected to be inoffensive and was therefore usually forgettable, but which on this particular drive was making no specific demands on him and therefore was exactly right. He stopped at a hardware store, bought a new set of leveling feet for the cradle's uneven base, drove home. Elena was at the kitchen table when he came in, her laptop open, working on the interior design consulting she had quietly resumed in the past month, a practice she had let go in the second year of their marriage without quite deciding to, the way things go in lives that have stopped being organized around what you need. She looked up when he came in, looked at the bag in his hand. "Hardware store," he said. "The cradle." "The foot." She looked at him for a moment. "I told you not to fix it." "You told me not to fix it when it was the only thing I'd made," he said. "There'll be others." He held her gaze. "I'm going to make other things. He needs furniture for when he's older, a bed, eventually, a desk." A pause. "If you'll let me." Elena looked at him. Something in her expression did the thing it had been doing more often in the past month. Not melting, that was not the right word, not Elena, but opening. The specific way of a person who has decided, incrementally and with full awareness, to let something in. "Fix the cradle," she said, "and then I want to show you something." He set the bag down and went to fix the cradle and came back and she showed him, on the laptop, a house listing she had found, larger than the one they were in, with a workshop space in the garage that had proper lighting and ventilation, not far from where they were, on a street where the driveways had bicycles in them. He looked at the listing, then at her. "For the furniture," she said. "When you make other things, you need space that isn't a rental garage." He looked at the listing again, at the workshop space with its good lighting, at the yard, at the street. "Okay," he said. She closed the laptop. From upstairs came the first sounds of Luca waking from his afternoon sleep, the small inventory sounds, the new-to-the-world taking of stock. Cassian was already moving toward the stairs. "I'll go," he said, the same words as the morning on the porch, and Elena sat at the kitchen table with her closed laptop and listened to him go upstairs, and she did not try to name what she was feeling because some things were not improved by being named. He came back down 20 minutes later with Luca on his left shoulder, which was the shoulder, and Luca was making the contented sounds of a person who has recently been lifted by familiar hands. And Cassian stood in the kitchen doorway, holding his son, and Elena looked at the two of them in the afternoon light of a November Wednesday, and something in her chest, which had been folded tight for a very long time, let go of one more layer. Not all of them. That was not how this worked. The layers were many, and the letting go was slow, and some of them would never fully release because that was the honest truth of what 4 years of absence and one terrible morning in a hotel corridor had made. And she had accepted that she was not going to be the woman she was before all of it, and she was not entirely sure that woman was one she wanted to return to. But she was here. They were here. In a kitchen in November with a child who had his father's eyes and his mother's refusal to be impressed by anything, in a life that had been remade from its own wreckage into something that had no precedent and therefore no ceiling. "He needs to eat soon," Elena said. "I know," Cassian said. "He's been making the face." "What face?" He turned Luca slightly so she could see, and Luca, as if on cue, made the face, the specific compressed expression of a person who has not yet eaten and has opinions about this. And Elena laughed. Not the polite laugh of a person performing ease. The actual laugh, sudden and unguarded, the one that arrived before her face knew it was coming. Cassian watched her laugh. He had not heard that laugh in almost a year. He had not realized, until he heard it again, how specifically he had missed it. Not the absence of laughter in general, but the exact particular frequency of hers, irreplaceable, unreplicable, the sound of Elena Voss being caught off guard by something genuinely funny. He looked at her. She was already composing herself, already reaching for Luca, the laugh settling back into the ordinary expression of a woman who has things to do. "Sit down," she said, taking the baby. "I'll make something." He sat down at the kitchen table where 4 months ago she had shown him the housing listing and where, before that, in the Fairfield house, she had pressed a cold cloth to his split lip with the particular competence of someone who had decided to do a thing and was doing it. He sat and watched her move through the kitchen with their son against her shoulder and the late November light coming through the window over the sink, and he thought about what she had said on the Sunday porch. "I think we might be something I don't have a word for yet." And he thought that she was right. That there was no word for it because it hadn't existed before now, because they were building it from what had survived the rest. And what survived was not clean or simple or easily described. It was real, though. He was certain of that. Realer than most things he had been certain of across a life built on certainties. Luca made a sound against Elena's shoulder. She adjusted her hold without looking up from what she was doing at the counter. Cassian sat in his chair in the kitchen of the house on the street where people left bicycles in driveways, in a life that was smaller than the one he had spent 20 years constructing and larger than anything that life had actually contained. And he did not reach for his phone, and he did not think about what needed handling tomorrow, and he did not plan the next move. He stayed. That was the whole of it. That was the complete shape of the decision and the change and the long, difficult road from the man he had been to the man sitting in this chair. Not a single dramatic conversion, but 1,000 small arrivals at the same place. The kitchen, the chair, the ordinary Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday of a life that had chosen to include him again after he had done the work of being worth including. It was not a destination. He understood that. The destinations were for the kind of stories that ended cleanly. This was not that kind of story. This was the kind that continued past the last page, that sent its people forward into ordinary time with all their damage and all their love and the daily requirement to show up as the version of themselves they were still becoming. He watched Elena at the counter, watched his son's fingers close and open against her shoulder, that small, unconscious grip that infants have, the fingers of a person who is learning that the world can be held. Outside, November was doing what November did, arriving fully, darkening early, the trees stripped and honest against a sky that had no interest in sentimentality. Inside the kitchen, the light was warm and the smell was of whatever Elena was making, and the sounds were of a small person being fed and a man sitting still in a chair for no reason other than that this was where he needed to be. The house settled around them. The street outside went through its quiet evening. Somewhere down the block a porch light came on. Cassian Moretti, who had once been the most feared man on the East Coast, who had built an empire on blood and precision and the willingness to occupy the space that other men flinched from, who had lost nearly everything that mattered through the accumulated negligence of a man who confused power with presence, sat at his kitchen table and watched his family in the light, and let that be enough. It was.